You are revealing the internal structure of your mind and heart.
Welcome to the Wordsmith for Christian Fiction podcast. My name is Mike Baines, and I'm your host. Before we get into this conversation, I want to pause for just a moment and set the stage, because this interview is a little different from most I do, and I think it deserves that. If you find value in thoughtful conversations about writing, faith, and the real tension between the two, I'd ask you to subscribe, like, and share this episode. Not because it helps an algorithm, but because these kinds of conversations are easy to miss and hard to find. Most discussions about Christian fiction stay in familiar territory. This one doesn't. It explores what it looks like to carry faith into places where it isn't expected, isn't welcomed, and isn't labeled, but still matters. Sharing this episode helps it reach writers and readers who may be wrestling quietly with those same questions, often on their own. My guest, Bunn, brings a voice shaped not only by decades of successful storytelling, but by a journey that has moved well beyond the traditional boundaries of Christian publishing. While Davis has written extensively in the Christian arena in the past, much of his recent work unfolds in the mainstream worlds of New York publishing and Hollywood screenwriting, spaces not exactly known for welcoming faith. Because of that, this interview took a turn I didn't fully anticipate. We didn't follow the usual path. We didn't linger on familiar questions or comfortable categories. Instead, we talked honestly about what it means to live out belief in places where faith is often misunderstood, sidelined, or quietly resisted. This episode is less about labels and more about vocation, about craft, conviction, and the hard work of staying true to who you are while working in industries that don't share your assumptions. It's thoughtful, occasionally challenging, and deeply grounded in experience. I'm grateful Davis was willing to go there, and I think you'll find this conversation worth your attention. All right, let's get into it. Audience, would you please join me in welcoming Bunn to the Wordsmith Forge Christian Fiction podcast? Davis, we're so happy that we were able to work into your schedule. We know you're a very busy author. Would you mind telling the audience about yourself?
You know, this is the first time in 7 years that I've actually had an interview with a Christian-based program. So the answers that come as part of my standard spiel don't necessarily apply here. From the faith perspective, I came to faith at age 28 and started writing 2 weeks later. I was an international business consultant based in Germany and operating through most of Western Europe, and wrote for 9 years and finished 7 books before my first was accepted for publication. During that time, most of the time, I was in 2 and sometimes 3 countries every week. So learning the discipline of faith ended up being an essential component of learning the discipline of writing through that period.
Well, where do you live now? I know that might be a long answer, but...
No, we lived for almost 20 years, half of the time in Florida and half of the time in England. Florida, both because it's where I called home most recently in the United States, and also because my wife was teaching 1 term a year at the university here. Then the year before COVID, she accepted a new position and we sold our place in the United States. And since then, we've been living full time in England.
You've really moved around a lot, but do you have some places that are special to you? Some place where you like to go to kind of recharge your batteries or renew your soul?
Our life is probably very different from a lot of the writers that you work with. We are very busy.
I can
And
imagine.
what works best for us right now is a way of maintaining a sense of recharge on more or less a daily basis. It's probably been 10 years since we took a holiday where neither of us worked. We're we're back in Florida right now, living in a condo that's about 2 miles from where our home used to be in a little place called South Melbourne Beach. It's about as remote as you can get on the Florida coast. We are a 12-mile round trip from the closest place where we can buy milk. And it's just wonderful. It really is. But since arriving here 4 weeks ago, I have completed a new story for my New York publisher and done the major rewrites on a book for my British publisher. And I'm now back working on completing the story that I should have been working on in December. So that's on the creative side. That's our time. And Isabella's much busier than I am. She's much busier.
Goodness.
So finding a chance to do that on a daily basis is a lot more important than it would be, I think, for a lot of writers that are having their time compressed by family. And
what is it like trying to work in the world and still maintain your faith?
There are two basic answers to that. As a believer, quite frankly, I feel like this is where I belong, and my wife feels the same. In many, many cases these days, we are the only believers in the room. The one exception we have is I am writer in residence, and my wife is what's now called a research fellow, which we must be respected for the quality of our work and us as people. Our statement of faith in many cases is a detriment to actually getting something done. So the sort of standard questions that we often hear from within the evangelical community, in other circumstances than this, we would simply politely just turn away. They just don't fit. There are a number of very strong believers working both within the New York publishing world and inside the LA film and streaming worlds. But in order to exist in a situation where the majority of people are anti-Christian, anti-faith, there has to be a redefining of how we move forward.
That, I think that would make it very difficult. How do you redefine that?
Well, you have to be at peace with yourself. You have to find a way forward that is in harmony with who you are as a member of the faith community. On the creative side, it's a different story. I have been, as I said, it's been a long time since I've spoken inside the faith community in an interview. And I've been trying to come up with a way of describing what it means to write as a believer for it's not that your audience is non-believing, it's that the publishing arena is not welcoming. And I haven't found, it was a gradual process for me. I wrote 3 books for Doubleday in this sort of transition period, and then went back and wrote 10 books for Thomas Nelson, writing for the mainstream arena, but within the evangelical community, and then moved to Simon & Schuster. And from Simon & Schuster, I moved to Kensington. So it's been 12 years, more or less, since that transition actually took place. And it's hard to remember exactly how I came to that point of finding personal harmony on the creative side with what is required inside the writing structure. What the standout when I was thinking how I would answer this has to do with what it meant to start writing screenplays for LA. I had done 7 or 8 scripts, what are called spec scripts, where I'm not wasn't working under a contract. In a couple of cases, I was working under contract, but there was still a sense of dissatisfaction is not strong enough, but there was more sense of I was groping creatively. I wasn't clear on what really was required to have a solid success in screenwriting. And about 7 years ago, I had a family member that was going through cancer surgery 4 times and then chemo. And I can still remember during that period, it became increasingly difficult to work on a new project where I was divorcing myself entirely from the outside world and working on a set of emotions and characters that were only inside my own head.
Yeah.
So I decided to go back and start working on a screenplay that I had started and then set aside because of the pressures on I had contracts for the novels. I didn't have contract on the script. And I can still remember there was a day about 3 weeks into the start of the chemo process where I had I guess epiphany is the strongest and clearest way to say it. I was sitting in the cafe. I can still remember that moment when the way that I was seeing the screenplay just dropped away. Everything that I had done to that point in terms of the perspective on the writing of script was founded upon things that were not complete. And the first thing that I had to do in order to make this happen was to take a step back away from the story that I was telling and stop looking at it from the structure of the book that it was founded upon, and instead strip away everything and look at it solely from how this is going to appear on the screen. And in many cases, that meant actually going back and retelling the story a different way. Defensiveness inside this position was a lie, both to myself and to the creative process. And then this became the first major project that was sold to LA. It's been acquired by the producer who did Shrek and Iron Man. And there was a similar sort of more gradual process in moving from the evangelical community to writing for the mainstream, where it's not possible simply to take out the evangelical components. The entire structure of the story has to be redefined by the audience expectations. The question then is, once you have found this, once you've identified with this, are you able to maintain your statement of faith within these strictures? And for me, it's been natural, hard, but natural.
Yeah, I have a lot of questions boiling up, but I'm not sure I can distill them out to something real coherent. But I'm thinking about a movement separate from Hollywood, but akin to it. The only person that pops in my head is Mel Gibson. But there is a pushback on, well, let me just use the word wokeness. Uh, I don't know. I think of Louis L'Amour, who was very popular and successful writer, but yet he didn't use any vulgarity in his writing. And it seems like we're moving to a place to where there is a very good market for screenplays, movies that are not vulgar. I mean, we have great imaginations. We can imagine someone using an expletive. We can imagine what explicit sex scenes would be like. We don't necessarily have to say it or show it. Do you see any connection with the kinds of work that you do that would fit into a, from my perspective, would be a cleaner form of entertainment?
Well, I mean, the short answer is I feel like all of my books carry that same sort of creed. But let's go back to just one example of what that actually means. In dialogue, the key element and the reason there, I think I've now been teaching writing for a long time, 30 years. I can't believe that's actually the truth, but around 30 years. The two key elements that I find repeatedly are the reasons why good writers don't become great or commercially successful writers is weakness in the point of view and weakness in dialogue.
Mm-hmm.
Both of these come back to the same element. Point of view means it is absolutely essential that the writer disappear from the page. Everything that happens through the eyes of the principal character of that scene. Okay. Dialogue is very similar to that. When you and I talk, and we're not talking about a situation like this where it's, formal,
right?
But where you and I are talking, if you actually listen to what's being said, the majority of what is spoken really is a revelation of the person who is speaking. It's not about what is being said as intent. That is a secondary thing. You are revealing the internal structure of your mind and heart, the defenses that you carry, the weaknesses, the passions. All of this comes out in the way that you speak or don't speak. And one of the first time I ever came into contact with this, Lawrence Block, who was a very big author back 30 years ago, and Herman Wouk, who wrote War and Remembrance, Marjorie Morningstar. He was one of the greatest authors of the 90s and the 2000s. Herman Wouk and Lawrence Block were having this conversation about dialogue at the first writers' conference I ever attended. And they both had this little pad. They had been on a bus together with a tour group, and the ladies, there were 4 ladies in the 2 sides of the row ahead of them. They were having this conversation, and the 2 of them, Lawrence took one side and Herman took the other side, and they had this conversation where the women never finished a sentence, but you knew exactly who they were and what they were saying, not just what they were talking about externally, but who they were as people. So nowadays, and it's made me a lot of enemies, but nowadays, if I'm teaching a new class with either a freshman class at university or a high school class, while the kids are filing in, I will listen to everything that I can hear on the first 2 rows, and I will write it in very small script on the blackboard. And then my introduction when I start talking is I will say, this is what I just heard, and I'll read it all out, and I'll talk to them about the structure of this dialogue, which really is, and the girls particularly, they just I've really gotten some stink eyes at the end of these classes, but it reveals who they are,
Yeah,
not what they're talking about, but who
right.
they are. And that's what three-dimensional dialogue has to do.
Yeah.
If you do this, if you succeed with this, then bad language is secondary. If you have a bad guy, I've recently been reading one of Stephen King's, I hate horror, but I really like his mysteries. And it's interesting to see just how evil these people are. And there's no bad language. You don't need
Yeah.
it. If
No,
your
you don't.
dialogue is well structured, it's just not there.
Yeah.
The most recent story I did for New York, is a coming of age story where the child is growing up during the first Trump presidency. And the question that he is constantly being forced to ask himself is one of identity. He is estranged. His mother is dead. He's estranged from his father. He's raised in um, basically a school for gifted kids, but as an orphan. And the struggle that he goes through is the same struggle that we found repeatedly in our university students and in the society around us. But here I'm talking about the societies in Europe more than in the United States. So the problems in England are both very different and very much the same. And I think that there's a very real risk that the next government is going to be, both in France and in the United Kingdom, and possibly in the Netherlands, going back to what they had before, is going to be one that is extremely antagonistic towards outsiders. So, you know, England's an interesting place in that regard. They asked the Indians and Caribbean workers to come in after World War II. And now there's a sense of forgetting that they were the ones that effectively bribed these people to come over and work. It's interesting to me to see the attitude towards immigrants today when for so long the United States has been one founded upon immigrant society. I don't know how to answer your question any other way than that.
Well, I did not think I was asking it as far as a government is concerned, because I see uh, our spiritual revival is independent of the government, although the government certainly dictates how effective and easily that will happen. I talked to an author in South Africa, and he has nothing but horror stories. And Christians in Nigeria are struggling. People in Venezuela, I don't know whether they're happy or disappointed at the heavy-handedness that the current administration has taken. I think there's probably some of both. But through it all, something that many of us believe is much more important than who's running the country is are you as a person upholding your biblical principles and beliefs? And that that can shape the government. So I feel like God's universe is more powerful as he decides to implement it than what we have with our human government. So, moving on, you have written some uh, evangelical type books, and then you've moved away from that. Was there some reason that you have not continued writing Christian books?
No, um, I don't have a real answer for that. I've often wondered if I'll go back to it. It's a valid question. I wrote Oh gosh, I published more than 40 titles in the Christian arena. And when I made the initial transition over to New York, I increasingly found myself coming face to face with the fact that the majority of books that I myself want to read do not come from the Christian arena. And it's the same with the entertainment for the streaming, the films that I prefer. The question for me, really, the dominant question for the last 12 years is, how can I instill into mainstream entertainment an element of what it is that I define as the finest components of faith?
One of my authors, I think, kind of addresses that. He says that Christian fiction allows you to walk through an exciting, gritty world without feeling dirty.
That's lovely.
The emergency room doctor writes about a retired Navy SEAL and an emergency room nurse that are in Brazil or somewhere, and they're rescuing women from the sex trade traffic. I think Christian fiction for years has kind of gotten a bad rap as being all milquetoast and wishy-washy, pie in the sky, goody two shoes, however you want to say it. And it's dominated by women writing romance novels. So I think a lot of the authors that I talk to are writing exciting, gritty, real stuff. Michael Swigert did 18 years of a 20-year sentence in prison because he wouldn't turn evidence on his brother. And he gave his life to Christ in county jail before he started his prison sentence. And while he was in prison, he wrote quite a few really good books, interviewing real people that had done real crimes. The San Francisco lawyer that is writing about Silicon Valley people, the young couple working in artificial intelligence that developed a chat box, and her husband dies unexpectedly, and she puts everything he ever said, wrote, any videos in a chat box. So when she comes home from work, she says, "Hi, dear, how was your day?" And the chat box responds, "Same as always. How was yours? Blah, blah, blah. Remember the 5th anniversary? You had the mousse and I had the chocolate delight." She comes home from work one day and says, "Tell me something about yourself that I don't know." And the chat box says, "I think I was murdered," which is the introduction to the book. That's the hook. So there's some real gritty stuff out there, some hardcore, if you will, mysteries and whodunits, dramas that aren't romance novels. And I guess that's one reason I'm doing this podcast, is I want to showcase those authors that are writing about the real world that we live in, that we deal with. Sex trade, traffic, wars, all just, there's dystopia, sci-fi. There's all kinds of books out there that are not your wishy-washy stuff. So I'm not sure why I launched that tirade. I appreciate you tolerating it. But that's where I think Christian fiction is going, and I hope we leave the goody two shoes idea, because it's not real. We live in. I've worked with the incident management teams for national disasters, take care of the human aspect of things. How are people being treated, and make sure we're not bullying people, things like that. And I hear the worst of the worst, because people come from all walks of life. When you bring together 1,500 people to focus on a wildfire, 508,000 acres, Uh, so I have to tuck my religious beliefs kind of under a cover, and at times I can let it out, but it's there, and I deal with it, and I don't let it get in the way of me doing business. There's several times I felt like my career was going to be threatened because I could not adhere to what the administration was telling me I needed to do. So, there it is. A lot of my questions on my teleprompter, as I mentioned, you've answered. Here's kind of one that you might speak to. Do you relate to the characters that you put in your books? I
Always
know,
have.
so you can see yourself in there. Do you feel like there's something that sets your books apart from most of the others?
I don't like comparing. What I feel like is it's one of the reasons why I teach is to try to help elevate. I had an opportunity recently to speak at a major gathering of authors, and the assignment that I was given was how to help authors who have published become full-time writers. That's the sort of issues that I really like to apply myself to. How do you get from the position of having had a couple of books that have come out to where your career, your sole source of income is your writing? And I feel like that in many cases, what needs to happen is not a reexamination of everything that goes into making your books, but an honest appraisal of where your current weaknesses lie. The example I use in starting the classes was from there were two recent studies that really impacted me. The most successful coaches in the world spend 90% of their time on the 10% weakest elements of their students' professional career. These are coaches of professional athletes.
Right.
90% of their time is spent on the 10% weakest segments of their athlete's life. The other was in the last 4 Olympics, 2 summer, 2 winter. Every medalist in the American team used envisioning, positive envisioning of one kind or another going into this. I feel like what I face most often in working with authors who have arrived at that first step in the success ladder and are struggling to make the next step is a sort of entrenched defensiveness. They are unwilling to sort of unravel part of what their work is and examine it from the standpoint of how can I be better. Instead, what happens is they double down on their strengths. And no matter how much you add extra action, if it's your characters that are weak, if your dialogue is not solid, if your point of view is not fully in the eye of the individual in charge and then switching to the next individual, the amount of action doesn't matter because your characters don't resonate with the reader.
Yeah, I get that. If you only improve your strong points, it's already strong. You need to be able to look critically at your weak points. You mentioned something when you were writing that screenplay. You said you had kind of an epiphany that this needs to be changed. This needs to be written from a kind of a different point of view. Is that something that has happened before as you were writing, was there anything about the story that surprised you? Like you think you're going from point A to point B, but your character makes a left-hand turn without using his turn signals, and you have to write to find out where they're going.
I think that happens with every author. Again, now we're moving in from the general audience into your listeners who are writers. The problem is not
Right.
that this happens. The problem is the result can be you assume that this component is actually something essential to the finished story. When you're working on the redraft, one of the elements that's most important in creating a successful commercial story is accepting that everything that is not specifically in tune with the climax has to be pared away or rewritten so that it is. So when you're when you're rereading some of these epiphany moments, they may sound absolutely spectacular, but they also may not fit. I was talking about this with a friend who is a major Christian publisher, and he said the equivalent that happens in his world is when he has someone come up to them, he and the editor, and say, God told me to write this book. And the answer that they have all too often, or they're forced to say, is, well, God has not told me to publish it. I think what has to happen here is in the second draft, you are moving from the creative and all of these epiphanies that you're talking about to the broader audience, the buyer, the editor, but beyond that, also the reader. They need to feel what you feel. And the only way that that's going to happen is if each of these scenic structures are linked to the tension line that brings them to the climax.
Yeah. Forgive me if I stray here, but you reminded me of an old story I heard about a young man that was determined God wanted him to be a preacher. And so his pastor let him have the pulpit one Sunday, and he just did a terrible job. And so the pastor said, "Why on earth do you think God wants you to be a preacher?" And the young man said, "Well, I was out plowing some corn, cultivating it, and I saw the clouds form these letters, G, P. Anyway, it said, go preach the gospel." And the pastor said, "Are you sure it didn't say go plow corn?" So we do tend to want to interpret things in a way that suits our fancy. And in a way, I have this saying about writers and authors. If you can string some sentences together and get a front cover and a back cover and go through Kindle and get it published, you're an author because your name's on the front cover. Writing is a whole nother story. It takes skill and knowledge to be a writer. Anyone can be an author. Maybe we should all just go plow corn, though.
Well, yeah, it certainly is tempting. I recently read about the other side of this, obviously, is when the inspiration really carries a divine impact. Harriet Beecher Stowe was unpublished, had really never had much experience in writing anything more than letters and the occasional article for small regional newspapers. When she, according to her own story, God told her to write the story and planted the seed in her heart for Uncle Tom's Cabin. So these things do happen, and they can't be set aside very easily. But there is a difference between there's a huge difference between what is divinely inspired and what is commercially viable sometimes. And that is the issue. There has to be a sort of a tuning fork that you use when you're going into that second draft. And for me, that is, how do you pare it down so that it works in harmony with the story's principal direction?
Right. I'm sure you could draw a bell-shaped curve of all the things that God has told people. And there's right in the middle is what people think. And that outlier on the positive side is what God actually said. Well, Davis, for me, this has been a very enlightening and interesting conversation. My habit is to end things with a word of prayer. Do you mind?
Not at all. Thank you.
Thank you. Our Heavenly Father, we just stand in awe at the many skills and talents that you give people. And on the art side, painters, writers, that's a gift. Some have and some imitate, but we do recognize those that truly have a gift to put their thoughts, their lives on paper in the form of characters that they've created. And we just ask that you bless the work of Davis and his wife as they continue. Spread your grace over their family. May you keep them productive for many years to come, to all of our benefit. And we just ask that you go with us throughout this life and encourage us. In thy name we pray. Amen.
Amen. That was lovely.
So,
thank you very much. That's a beautiful way to finish.
I hope you enjoy Florida while you're there, and safe travels. It's
now
been a
that
pleasure
the two
to meet you.
manuscripts are off, life has re-entered a sort of a less manic mode.
Take care, my brother.
Thank you. And you.
Bye.
And you.
As we wrap up today's episode, I want to thank Davis Bunn for his candor, his patience, and his willingness to let this conversation be what it needed to be, rather than what it was expected to be. Not every interview fits neatly into a category. Not every calling looks the same. And not every faithful life unfolds in familiar spaces. What struck me most in this discussion was the quiet seriousness with which Davis approaches both his craft and his convictions, without spectacle, without slogans, and without shortcuts. For those of you who write, this episode offers hard-earned insight into discipline, dialogue, point of view, and the humility required to grow. For those of you who simply read or listen, it offers a glimpse into what it looks like to walk faithfully in places where faith isn't the norm. Sometimes the Forge doesn't just shape stories, it sharpens perspective. Thanks for spending this time with us. Until next time, keep reading, keep writing, and keep seeking truth wherever God places you. This is Mike Baines, out.